Yeah, yeah,
limitation.
yeah, exactly. But if you pay, I'll give you and I'll give you and I'll give you, and I'll never stop giving you. And that's where I think the dangers could be, because it doesn't have any form of it will never stop giving you what you think you want.
I
And
think that brings it back to an argument I've posited before that self-control
mm,
is the ultimate force that's going to win out. It's only those of us who have any sense of self-control, where we monitor and control ourselves. You know, if we're going back to our concept of fences and what are the protections we put in place to
yeah,
protect those we care about, if we're going back to the idea of the yellow brick road, you know, and this pathway and that pathway is an internal psychological event where our internal psyche and all the different characters from the Wizard of Oz are part of our psyche, and we're just learning about ourselves. And then but you follow the path because the path leads you to a place where you finally understand yourself, and you can come out of that internal space thinking more externally, more about others, being more concerned about the welfare and the well-being of others. And that concept of selflessness requires a full understanding of self. In order to be selfless, you have to have a full capacity of yourself, which means you need to be in control of yourself to be adequately selfless towards others. And that's a concept that I think is a little scary when you're thinking about AI and how quickly it can feed the hubris of the human intellect and the human psyche. And that it, you know, sure, it might take us down a yellow brick road path, but AI can change the color of the road and can take us off the path, and we can become one of the characters like the Wicked Witch or the Lion or something else. And you know, all these characters in that particular path were they were on the sides, right? They were not on the path, they were off to the sides, and they were almost like temporary distractions until they were brought onto the path and became a part of the psyche. As almost as if like Dorothy was learning something about herself as she was going and bringing parts of her psyche together to make a complete whole person. And you know, and she had to destroy the witch because the witch was the worst part of her, you know. And then even at the end, she got to the professor behind the curtain, you know, and her familiar Toto got into, you know, unveiling the curtain for her. But even the professor became a part of the journey home and became a part of her final psyche, where she came out of herself and realized that there's other people in the world besides herself. And that's you know, that's the thing is, you know, if Seymour is feeding us and our hubris, and we don't want to be the monster, then we have to learn to curb our appetites and curb our enthusiasm about just what it is that we're feeding ourselves. And the only way to do that is to think outside of ourselves and consider others in the world. And so that's where it becomes a bit of a mixed bag on what in the world are we supposed to do with this new technology, and how are we supposed to use it to great effect.
yeah, and of course it's not sold to us in that way at all.
No.
And the narrative about it is not sold in that way or told, and it's not something that people necessarily are thinking about, um, which I think is a big problem for everybody, um,
Yeah.
because what's the best way of putting this really? Um, we've been given this wonderful tool, but nobody's told us how to use it. And as you say, it's in one of our previous clips, it becomes very transactional and outward looking rather than inward looking, which is for me personally, which I think is it's hidden strength, if that makes sense,
Mhm.
which we don't necessarily what we talk about it, but society in general hasn't seen it in that way. Um, yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it, really, as to where all this will go. And I mean, you and I can talk about this, and people who are watching this video might think the same thing. But there are 8 billion people on this planet, and with the best will in the world, I don't think 8 billion people are going to look at AI in the same way that we're looking at it. And I don't know where we go with that. Um, Obviously, not if all of the 8 billion people on the planet will use AI, obviously not. But it's, I think the narrative about it is wrong.
Mm. Well, you talk about being transactional, and then we mentioned like the pay for play, right? Like
Mm,
AI only goes as far as you pay it to go, but
yeah,
if you keep paying it, it'll keep going.
yeah.
Well, the funny thing is, the reason why you're paying AI is because there's a human being associated with your access to AI that wants that money,
Mm.
and we are feeding the hubris, we are feeding the machine of so the Seymour and the greedy plant may be a combination of just all humans, and AI might be the food.
Yeah,
It may,
could be. Yeah, that's
you
a
know,
great analogy. Yeah.
AI just may be the carnivorous diet of the
Mm.
rest of us humans, essentially, that we're consuming as, and maybe there's two plants feeding each other. You know, it's
Well,
the
that
pathway to logic is a little bit disjointed at times because there's always a human in the loop, like the solution to the problem is a human in the loop, right? That's how most of us look at that. Like if there is a problem, put a human back into the loop. You need to have systems based thinking, and you need to consider individuals, and you need to have an outward mindset and all these kinds of things. But there's always that's the human factor. That's what the humans do. We think of other human beings. We have an outward mindset. This is what separates us from the other animals on the planet, is this thinking of others. I mean, there may be some measure of compassion and emotion, or something else that we can recognize or can distinguish in the patterns that we observe of other creatures on the planet. But nothing is as selfless or as giving or as destructive and evil as a
yeah,
human being.
that
And
that is so true. I mean, you can look at, I mean, many animals are very sort of pack orientated, aren't they? Look after themselves. Lions, particularly, and whales and dolphins and all of those sort of creatures. You see, but sometimes I think we project our human behavior onto animals in a way that we probably shouldn't, because they think in a slightly different way. So I'm always a little bit cautious about that. But you can see,
Mhm.
and well, elephants are a great example, because elephants will bring in, if there's a young elephant that's been orphaned or whatever it is, another family of elephants will bring them into the herd, and all of that. So they look after themselves, um, in a way that human society, we like to think we do, but generally and often we don't, in a way that we should. But that's for a whole nother podcast. But yeah, I think AI just brings the best and the worst out of us. And but when you talk about there's being a human, with the AI being the meat for the monster, which is another human being, you're talking about rampant capitalism there, and that's unfortunately, um, the way that our society has been built. And I think some people, not, I don't want to get too political about it, but I
Mhm.
think some people find capitalism their religion.
Yeah,
You know?
I would agree that some people are overly enthusiastic about their favorite form of economic functionality.
Yeah.
Um, but at the same time, um, you know, I don't think that putting up a fence on every road, right? Like that's how we were talking about before, is like putting up. And so, if you're going to go the opposite direction of a capitalistic ideology, now you're getting into socialistic stuff, right? Now you're talking about the concept of who owns what and who is the arbitrator of who owns what, right? And that's, and so it's really annoying when you set people free and they run off and do the worst thing possible. That's so annoying. Like if you tell children it's time for recess and they run out of the schoolyard and into the streets and off to the shops and everywhere else, and they're not staying in the schoolyard, that's really, really annoying. And when we think of children, we want to protect them, we want to keep them safe and all that. And so we put a fence up around the schoolyard and said, don't leave the fence and
Yeah,
don't let people in the fence and things like that. And that makes sense for those of us who are older and more mature. We're trying to protect those who are younger. But then once we're all grown and we're adults and we're given a break, during a conference or something like that, if somebody wants to cross the street and go to a shop and go anywhere else for lunch besides sitting there in the stuff that's been provided by the conference center, that's their prerogative and they're allowed to go and do that. And it's what's wrong with that is nothing because it's full autonomy. But then you have the problem of, well, what if some adult during a break of their conference decides to run off and to go to some schoolyard and start messing with children, right?
yeah,
In their full autonomy that they get. Well, that's a horrible thing. We can't. So nobody's allowed to leave the conference center because one of you might be somebody who's going to go mess with children during the break, and we just can't have that, right? Like that's a step too far for everybody who otherwise wouldn't be doing that. And so, you have to decide. It doesn't matter what your preferred economic model is. The question at hand that has to be answered is how much of your own liberty, if you will, that's a favorite word of ours over here on this
yeah,
side of the
yeah,
world.
yeah.
How much of your own personal liberty and freedom are you willing to give up for a certain measure of safety and security? And that's what you have to do. Like if the safer you are, the less liberty you have. You think of the safest creature on the planet. I think of a human baby who is protected by walls and bassinets and little contraptions like seatbelts and by families and by police and military and we protect whole nations to keep babies alive and well and having a good time in their safe little environments in the living room floor of their home somewhere wherever they live, right? The entire construction of society is based on protecting the smallest, most innocent part of us, right? But guess what? Guess who has the least freedom, who's the most captive of all of us? And it's an infant. Now,
Mm.
granted, an infant cannot take care of itself. It cannot feed itself. It cannot, provide for itself. So there's some aspects of what it cannot do on its own that require a certain amount of security to hold it. But an infant is not free to go where it wants, to do what it wants, to even act as it pleases. If a baby cries, we stop it from crying. If a baby is sleepy, we make it go to bed and take a nap, and they deal with that and structure and formality. Those are all good things for infants, right? You need to give them their structure. They need routines. They need
Yeah,
patterns. That's good for the human being to develop is to have boundaries and safety measures and things like that. But then where do we get our boundaries when we're no longer infants, when we are no longer.
exactly. Exactly. Because if you have a very informative growing up in whatever cultural society you're in, doesn't make any difference. But you accept the norms and all the rest of it of that particular culture. And then keeping on the AI theme, you
Mhm.
suddenly get this thing in front of you, which allows you in the privacy of your own room or on the privacy of your own phone or your computer, whatever, allows you to do whatever you want. Because